Don't get any ideas.
Yeah, really. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to what your research says about executive director loss and how organizations, whether there's predictors of what organizations, whether that.
You know, it's interesting. There are break points where nonprofits tend to have a harder time surviving them. So on the funding research that we've done, there are these break points where nonprofits transition from dominantly funded by a source to mixed to not. And when we look at the data of the frequency of nonprofits, there's fall-offs, right? But another point of equal or perhaps much more significant, greater danger is the transition of executive directors. And it just simply, so I don't have any great solutions to say once you've lost the executive director, what do you do other than try and find another executive director that fits in really well, right? And you can use executive search, you can use your networks, all of that. But I think the key to making that transition work obviously isn't after it's happened, it's before it's happened, which is this transition from personal organization to institutional, personal assets to institutional assets. And that's true on the program side. Although frankly, nonprofits seem to more readily transition the program activities to a set of other staff members that learn the processes, have the passion, etc. Than on the funding side, where often the key relationships are all held by that executive director. So you'll have organizations that grow with the vision of this person and maybe exist for 20, 30 years, which is essentially the career of that person, and then diminish greatly later. So, but you bring in a new person with new passions, maybe they reshape it, but when that new person is in, also think about how you make the institutional assets.
I don't mean this as an advertisement, just as a comment. 4 or 5 years ago, we actually tried to build a core competency around this because it happens all the time, right? And you just emphasize the point of how critical a moment that is. And we've been through this now 15, 20 times, and we hopefully, as a capacity builder, hopefully develop a core competency around ED transitions and how to what to tell the board to do and how to step up and get the funding to do it, etc. And you're just kind of accentuating.
And this is a place where philanthropy can play an enormous role, both in helping organizations through those transitions, before those transitions. There's a foundation in Boston called the Barr Foundation that has a very interesting program where essentially they pay executive directors that have been very successful in building their nonprofits and been there for a while to do, it's almost like a sabbatical. I forget if it's 6 or it's 12 months, but it's a relatively decent length of time to go study with other nonprofit leaders and do interesting things, which is a value to the participants, but the primary driver of it is to find a way to get the executive director out for 6 months or 12 months so that the organization has to survive, and they give some funding to the organization to fill the shoes. But it's essentially a trial run, if you will.
What do you think of that, Lisa? Somebody over here, Dave, you raised your hand.
Yeah, your point earlier around investment versus ongoing operations. It's interesting. I've seen different approaches and being introduced in some nonprofits where they talk about, hey, shouldn't everything be thought of as an investment? And you brought up, hey, you can look at different kinds of returns and things like that. Because the question all the time is allocation of resources. And just like a business has to, and sometimes the government steps in, allows car makers to continue the shoot, continue things like that, but businesses typically have to look at their resources and they reallocate.
Yep.
And so I wonder if the paradigm of investment, the thinking of investment, is something that has legs for nonprofits as an ongoing, rather than just, well, we got to get to this hump, and then it's just sort of everything's back to sort of rolling the tanks again.
I guess I think in some sense this distinction is more important for the funders than for the nonprofits as they think about their work. I mean, obviously, if to the extent what we mean by investment is putting your resources where it will have the greatest impact, all of the money should be thought of in that way, certainly. But one of the words that we throw around that Paul used, that I used, is capital, right? And we talk about the nonprofit capital markets. And there's all kinds of very interesting innovations going on to try and think about creating online marketplaces that are like Wall Street to allocate money. But if you think about how the money that gets allocated in the for-profit world through stock markets, right? I mean, raising equity is a a big commitment, right? You do it periodically. There's a story that has to go with it. You prepare. You have very high-level strategic conversations. People are doing tremendous amounts of analysis. And in some sense, one of the problems with the nonprofit world is that an enormous percent of the funders want to be treated that way, even for relatively modest dollars. And it creates what is just an unsupportable system for the nonprofit. So that type of analysis and thinking and infusion of cash on a periodic basis is totally appropriate when it's truly an investment that is one time and that takes an organization to a different place. And that kind of input and involvement, if you will, makes sense at that level. But again, I would hope that there are funders that in some sense say, we see what you're doing, we believe in the value of that service or that product, and we are willing to fund it. And it's not for 1 year, it's not for 5 years, it's for as long as you keep delivering that outcome. And we don't need to see at the strategic discussion level, and to think about which you want.
And I don't know if this helps, but he referenced the nonprofit finance fund work. And Lynn Coriano actually wrote a piece about this in her last newsletter. They call it buy versus build. It's those terms might be simpler. Buy means I'm just buying the ongoing service. I want, serve 100 more kids or serve 100 kids more effectively. Build means I want to grow the organization to a whole new level of scale, or I want to go to 5 new sites, etc. That's,
And it really
and I do think the distinction between the two of those gets.
And it's about the alignment and mismatch of expectations. I mean, one of the critiques of the world of foundations is that they don't give enough money, that they spread the money out in small doses across many organizations. And I believe in that critique very much. But one of the risks of giving large amounts of money, and perhaps one of the reasons foundations give small amounts, is it creates reliance. And one of the things that we see in our work, because the clients we work tend to skew towards organizations that major foundations believe in, is that an organization will develop an exciting program, have some way of funding it at a small level, attracts the interest of a handful of major institutional foundations that put in 7-figure annual amounts of money. The organization scales and grows, but that foundation has in mind some notion that they'll invest for 4 or 8 years and then leave. But yet 50%, 60%, 80% of the ongoing funding of this organization has come from that. And as opposed to the foundation money encouraging the organization to build the capacity for other sources of funds, it's done just the opposite, because that's the money that's been available. And in fact, people tend to do what they're good at doing. So the executive directors double down on their major institutional relationships, and it just, in some sense, it has the adverse effect of what it wanted.